This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded in front of a live audience here at the 2016 Limmud Conference in Birmingham, UK. My guest today is a Professor Emeritus of Judaic Studies at Stony Brook University in New York. He specializes in early Jewish history, especially during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Professor Robert Goldenberg, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've met many wonderful, wonderful people and heard many wonderful teachers, and now I can sit and talk.
Brilliant. That's exactly what I need you for. So let me ask you this. If a Jew today could build a time machine and go back 2,000 years, how foreign would the Jewish customs and rituals of the time would be to him or her?
Part of what's interesting about all that is that we know very little about those customs. We know what's written in the classical rabbinic books, the Mishnah and the Talmud, but we don't know much about how representative those books were of the larger Jewish world. We know that Jews all over the Mediterranean kept Shabbat, for example, but we don't know how they kept Shabbat. What did they do? What did they not do? I think it's pretty clear that anything written in the Torah became the basis of their Shabbat observance. And you find a remarkable amount of detail in Roman and Greek and especially Roman literature, although they often got it all wrong.
Mm-hmm. How do you mean wrong?
I'll tell you. The Romans sort of knew that Jews ate fish on Shabbat, though we don't know why. But there's a very famous Greek author, Plutarch, who wrote an essay explaining why it was that the Jews got drunk every Shabbat. Now, it may well be true that Jews drank a little wine every Shabbat, but I don't think they got any more drunk then than Jews get now, at least on Shabbat. I'm not talking about Purim. Mm-hmm. So they saw the Jews, but from the outside, the way really any ethnic group sees the life of another ethnic group, but always from the outside. So they got a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong. But what would be foreign? No doubt there were a lot of local customs, just like even today, Jews from here, whatever here is, will find the way Jews celebrate Shabbat there, whatever there is, differently. And they'll have to figure out, is that all right? Are they really violating Shabbat? Are they just doing it differently? And it all depends on who you ask. There weren't rabbis yet in most of the Jewish world, so we don't know who was guiding these people. We don't know who gave them instruction on what a proper Shabbat is like.
Mm-hmm. So we don't even know how the tradition evolved.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there were synagogues, but we don't know a whole lot about what went on in them. No doubt prayer went on in them. No doubt reading of the Torah went on in them. To everybody's dismay, no doubt sermons went on in them. But we don't know who was chosen to give the sermons. We don't know who was in charge. Mm-hmm. So that there's a lot that we can suspect but can't really show.
The very few accounts that are there, as you said, that were written by outsiders, is there any reason to doubt their authenticity? Did they have perhaps an axe to grind against the Jews?
Some of them may have, and others did not. The Roman Emperor Augustus himself wrote once in a private letter to someone, I am working very hard, which I'm sure he did. He was in charge of a lot. I am working very hard. I haven't had a chance to eat anything all day, just like a Jew on his Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Now, you can see that he knows something about Jews sometimes not eating anything all day, and we know that Yom Kippur is called Shabbat Shabbaton, but we don't know whether there were Jews who actually fasted every Shabbat. And this was in the city of Rome, where we know there were lots and lots and lots of Jews, but we don't know whether their practices were more alike or more different from the practices in Eretz Yisrael, which are that much better documented. Mm-hmm. So that's a very good example of something that a Roman sort of knew by observation, but didn't get quite right.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in that world, really, as we talk about these things.
Yeah, now comparing Jews in Rome and Jews in Eretz Israel, I'm trying to understand to what extent are we even able to say, to determine whether Jews out of Eretz Israel or in Eretz Israel at the time as well were affected by the rituals of the non-Jews around them.
To what degree did the Jews pick up aspects of foreign culture?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure they did. How can you not? Jews mostly then as now spoke the language of the country where they lived. People have this idea that the Jews in Eastern Europe all spoke Yiddish, and then they came to America, and they lost their own language. But it was speaking Yiddish in East European territory was the odd thing. Jews in the ancient world mostly spoke Greek if they lived in Greek-speaking countries, or Aramaic if they spoke in Aramaic countries. It's not at all clear that any Jews actually used Hebrew as their daily language anymore.
Yeah.
So with the language, no doubt came other kinds of customs. Let me give you one example. Jews introduce all holy events by drinking a little wine. Kiddush on Friday night, at holidays, at the beginning of a wedding ceremony, at the beginning of a Brit Milah. Somebody says the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen, and they drink a little wine. But there's no way that you would learn from the Torah that is how Jews ought to be celebrating a holy event. Mm-hmm. The only thing we know in the Torah is that if you want to be a Nazir, then you become holy by not drinking wine. So they must have looked around and seen people drinking wine as a ceremonial thing to do, and found a way to make that a Jewish ceremonial thing to do, though the exact course of the process by which that happened is very, very hard to trace.
But do you think that the Jewish community in Rome was more Romanized, as it were, than the Jewish community in
Eretz Israel?
In Eretz Israel.
I'm sure they were. The Jewish community in Eretz Israel may have been more Hellenized, because that part of the world spoke Greek. And also the Jews in Eretz Israel were much higher percentage of the population. They set the cultural tone. In Rome, the Romans set the cultural tone. Rome was full of ethnic minorities. The Jews were not the only people facing this situation. But everybody else picked up stuff from the atmosphere, just as Jews in America or here in the UK pick up a lot from the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And I don't see how it could work any other way. Exactly what the differences were are hard for me to tell you, because as I just said, we don't know that much really about the details of the Jews in Rome and how they did things.
Yeah. To what extent the destruction of the temple changed things? How radically was the change in real time?
In real time. The destruction of the temple meant certain things immediately. It meant that worshiping God the way the Torah says that God wants to be worshipped became impossible overnight. God wants to be worshipped, it seems, through sacrifice. And yet sacrifice was no longer possible. Something had to be done about that. In particular, one achieved atonement for one's sins by bringing certain particular sacrifices, korban chatat, a sin offering as we call it, etc. Those could no longer be brought. So there needed to be a way to gain atonement for your personal sins, and there needed to be a way for the community to organize its collective religious life. What the rabbis set out to do in the generations following the destruction of the temple was to figure out how that might be accomplished, and they did a remarkably good job of it. Mm-hmm. The other thing to be said is that Judea had been a wealthy territory because of all the tourist income. If you call it pilgrimage, it sounds very religious. If you call it tourism, it just sounds like the way in which a country makes money. The temple was a tourist attraction as well as a pilgrimage attraction, and all of that was lost. After the destruction of the temple, Judea as a country sank into poverty. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, life in the diaspora, other than the terrible psychological shock, probably went on pretty much undisturbed, because Jews had no temple there. Jews were doing without sacrifices, had figured out other ways to worship God already. Whatever it was worked pretty well for them, because these Jewish communities did not die out. They seemed to have prospered in their own way.
So did the diasporic lifestyle take over the entire Jewish world after the destruction, or did it have to be rearticulated?
There wasn't a diasporic lifestyle either. In other words, Jewish communities had local customs which, except for things that are stated in the Torah, were pretty much whatever they were, uncontrolled. Did all Jews eat fish on Friday night? I wouldn't say that just because one Roman had a feeling that Jews in Rome ate fish on Friday night. Did all Jews eat chicken soup on Friday night? Can you imagine Jews who don't eat chicken soup on Friday night? I know it's shocking, but I have a feeling they didn't. Who could afford to kill a chicken just to make soup out of it?
Yep.
So things varied. In the long run, what happened was the opposite. Over the years of late ancient history, moving into early Middle Ages, the rabbinic way of doing things began to become the norm. And that's also a process that's very hard to trace in detail. But if you look, say, at Spain by the year 800, maybe a bit later, 900, 1,000, all the Jews are following rabbinic customs. By now there are copies of the Talmud in Spain. By now, Jews are accustomed to rabbinic leadership. But there were Jews in Spain centuries before all of that who were doing all right, it seems, without rabbinic leadership.
So how do you explain that?
How do I explain how they did all right?
No, how do you explain why did it suddenly take over if they did all right before?
The truth is I can't explain that. I don't claim scholarly expertise in that later period.
Okay.
Whenever I think about it, I need to take a nap. Because it's a remarkable, one of the most important developments in all of Jewish history, and it's not well documented, and I just would love to know.
Mm-hmm. It must be very frustrating to be a historian of ancient
Very
periods
frustrating.
with this scarcity
Right.
of sources.
Right, as I'm retired now, as you said, but I used to tell my students we know more about every day of the Second World War than we know about any century of ancient history.
Yeah.
The trick is not to complain about that, but to figure out what questions are questions that you can answer, and to train yourself to answer those questions instead of all the questions that you can't answer.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have a bit of time for questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Thanks. So just picking up from what you were saying, is it settled? Do you think the history is settled, or are we still finding new things? Like, when was there last anything really exciting that was found that reveals more about the periods that are your area? Or any period?
Or any period. Well, certainly in Eretz Yisrael, where there's active archaeology going on, they're finding new things all the time. Some of them just deepen our knowledge within the existing schema. Every now and then, something really blows it apart. The most recent major blowing apart of things was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were completely unexpected, and there they were. Who knew that these people existed? And now we have to figure out, we're working at it, a kind of consensus has developed, but there is a lot of dissent from that consensus, if those two words can be used in one sentence, as to who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they got to be in the Dead Sea, why those people were there, were those the people who actually wrote the scrolls, all those kinds of questions. But that's a very good example of things that previous knowledge left no reason to expect, and yet there they were. Synagogue inscriptions, as is in the modern world. People wrote inscriptions. In the modern world, they tend to be on the wall. In the ancient world, they tended to be on the floor, worked in with mosaic, which is wonderful because the floors survived for 2,000 years and the walls more or less did not. So you learn lots of things. You learn, for example, that Jews put art onto those floors, real art, much of which looks like Greek and Roman art. They wouldn't have known that these were synagogues, really, except that the names of the donors, and of course the donors always insisted that their name goes into the inscription. The names of the donors were Jewish names, and some of the inscriptions said Harry Schwartz dedicated this synagogue in the name of his mother of blessed memory. At that point, you knew that Jews put art into synagogues. There was no getting away from it. So new things can happen. And I can't predict what is the next big thing that will happen in the nature of your question. But yes, such things are still... The possibility of such things has not yet been exhausted.
We had another question.
So we're recording this during Hanukkah, so I thought I'd ask a Hanukkah question. So when I was a kid growing up and learning about Hanukkah, it was always the story of the glorious Maccabees defeating the Syrio-Greek army. But then when you actually read the book of Maccabees, and as I've learned more, you discover it was as much, if not more, a kind of cultural and quite literally civil war between Hellenistic Jews and the Maccabees, who are kind of religious fundamentalists, I think it's probably fair to say. So my question is, do you think the average Jew today, if we were back then, would be cheering on the Maccabees or the Hellenistic Jews?
I think that's a very good question. I don't know if there is such a thing as an average Jew today. And if there was an average Jew back then, I've never met him. Well, I'm too young to have met. Who would I go to? I ask myself that every year, and the answer changes from one year to the next. The answer really is that I am what in England would be a Masorti Jew. That is to say, I try not to take a firm opinion about anything. And in something like the same way, I see the benefit of each side. Neither side was entirely admirable. One side was willing to use the king to impose their opinions on the people. The other side was willing to use the force of arms to impose their opinions on the people. When you read that the Maccabees themselves were riding around the countryside, forcibly circumcising the baby sons of parents who had decided not to do that, you realize that to portray the whole thing as a struggle for religious freedom doesn't quite get it right. So, as is often the case with civil wars, especially religious civil wars in the Middle East, it got pretty nasty pretty quickly. The other thing to add to your question is that without a certain kind of Roman intervention, it's not clear that the Maccabees would have won. That's a pretty long story. But I'll sit here in the UK and say that without the help of the King of France, it's not clear who would have won the American Revolutionary War either. That's how these things work. There was a very powerful difference of opinion in the highest levels of the Judean priestly elite as to how the temple should be run, as to how the Torah should be interpreted, whether the Torah should in fact be left in its place as the law book of the Jewish people. And it broke down into physical violence. And the king became upset because physical violence essentially meant that the province became less productive. There were farmers joining militias instead of growing crops that the king could seize. The king was in the business of seizing crops. That meant the king needed to restore order. And the king didn't quite know how to do that except clumsily. And the king failed at it in any case and lost his province altogether. So that's another way to think about the story as told on one foot.
All right, Professor Robert Goldenberg, Professor Emeritus of Judaic Studies at Stony Brook University in New York. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you. And to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host, Dalia Shandlin, will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.